Imagine walking through the heart of India in the 7th century, right alongside the famous traveler Xuanzang. At first glance, the scene he describes is, well, it's pretty impressive. He records seeing nearly 100 monasteries scattered across the Malwa region.
Right, populated by thousands of monks.
Over 2,000 monks, to be exact. So on paper, it looks like this thriving spiritual epicenter.
It does.
But then you start reading the fine print in his journals, and the whole picture just distorts. He wasn't witnessing a golden age at all.
No, not even close.
He was witnessing a slow-motion collapse. He describes these holy sites not as vibrant centers of learning, but as crumbling structures in a state of decay, just barely holding on.
And that's such a jarring observation when you realize where he was standing.
Exactly. This wasn't just some random province. This was Madhya Pradesh, the very place where Emperor Ashoka, years before he ruled the Mauryan Empire, served as a governor.
The cradle of his transformation.
It was right here in the city of Vidisha that he met his wife Devi, a devout Buddhist, and began the personal journey that would eventually spread Buddhism across the entire continent. He built the great stupa at Sanchi here,
intending it to be this eternal fortress for the faith.
So how does a region that served as the personal spiritual cradle of the greatest Buddhist emperor turn into a landscape of abandoned ruins? How did a religion backed by the strongest dynasty in Indian history just vanish from its own home?
That question, it captures one of the most profound and, frankly, puzzling historical conundrums of ancient India. It's a disappearance that didn't happen overnight.
Right.
And for a long time, scholars sort of curiously neglected it because it's a very, very difficult history to reconstruct.
Why so difficult?
We face a genuine challenge in providing a smooth, continuous narrative. There's a severe dearth of archaeological material documenting the decline. And on top of that, there's what you could call a stunning silence in the indigenous literature.
Meaning the local Indian texts just stop talking about it.
They just stop. The once dominant faith is just gone from the record. So we don't have a clear account of the decline because the people who survived, well, they weren't writing about it.
So we're left piecing it together from travelers' accounts like Xuanzang's and little bits of archaeology.
Precisely. And what the surviving evidence does reveal is not a single catastrophic event, but a deep structural rot. The decline was initiated by a fundamental flaw: the extreme dependence of institutional Buddhism, the Sangha, on external and material support.
The money.
The money. Its long-term survival was intrinsically linked to who held the political and economic purse strings.
Okay, so let's unpack this dependence. Historically, major religions survive by cultivating a deep, loyal following, a base that identifies fundamentally with the faith.
Right.
But you're suggesting Buddhism's model in India was inherently brittle because it relied almost entirely on elite patronage.
That's the core finding. The initial fatal flaw was this inalienable affiliation of institutional Buddhism with, and its dependence upon, two main groups: the royal families and the extremely affluent mercantile communities.
So the kings and the super-rich traders.
Yes. And if you look at how Buddhism presented itself to the average person, it rarely demanded a hard either decision. It didn't usually ask people to abandon their local gods or their priests or their traditions.
It wasn't exclusive.
Not at all. Instead, it was often presented merely as a supplement, a way to gain some ethical merit and spiritual wisdom alongside their existing spiritual life, which was already anchored in Brahmanical traditions.
It sounds like a faith that was academically rich and ethically profound, but socially kind of undemanding.
That's a great way to put it.
And the initial source of that massive injection of support, the one that made it so powerful across the continent, was Emperor Ashoka.
Yes, and this is where the paradox really begins. Ashoka was Buddhism's greatest patron. But his very policy, the Dhamma, which so successfully spread Buddhist influence, inadvertently sowed the seeds of its long-term secularization and eventual assimilation.
How could promoting good values be a mistake? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, Ashoka's Dhamma was intentionally non-sectarian. It focused on these generalized ethical principles. He constantly emphasized common sense morality, truthfulness, showing respect for superiors and elders, charity to all priests, and nonviolence.
Okay.
But he deliberately and almost entirely ignored the core, profound Buddhist doctrines in his widely disseminated edicts.
You mean he skipped the unique institutional demands, things like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the ultimate goal of nirvana?
Exactly. He skipped the secret sauce. By promoting only these generalized ethical concepts under the banner of Dhamma, He ensured that Buddhism looked very much like a generalized ethical system that was already sanctioned by the prevailing Brahmanical traditions.
So when a layperson heard Ashoka promote Dhamma, it just sounded like any other good advice they were already getting from their local priests.
Precisely. It lacked the specific, unique institutional demands that would have forced them to develop a distinct, non-Brahmanical Buddhist identity.
So he made Buddhism universally acceptable, but in the long run, universally disposable. Once the political winds changed, the religion became just a moral supplement. And if the Brahmanical system could offer those same ethics,
then what made Buddhism necessary anymore? That is the long-term consequence. And the political wind shift began surprisingly early.
when did that state patronage really start to shift away? Who was leading that pivot?
The initial major inflection point came right after the fall of the Mauryan Empire. The Shugas, and particularly Puyamitra around 185 BCE, are notorious in later Buddhist textual history.
Right.
Sources like the Divyavadana and the Tibetan historian Taranatha present him as this fanatical persecutor.
These are the sources that allege he offered a staggering bounty, 100 dinaras for the head of every Buddhist monk, and destroyed famous stupas.
Yes, that's the story. And it paints a picture of an outright religious holy war. But, historians are highly skeptical of universal, sustained persecution on that scale.
Why the skepticism?
Well, the tales themselves often read like highly charged polemics. And practically speaking, if a ruler truly sought to eradicate a religion, offering a bounty of 100 dinaras, a huge sum of money, for every single head would likely bankrupt his treasury long before it wiped out the faith.
Okay, so what does the counter-argument suggest was really happening?
The consensus suggests a couple of things. First, Puyamitra, who was a staunch adherent of Orthodox Brahmanism, likely did withdraw the lavish state patronage that the Mauryas had provided. And that alone was devastating enough to the institution's finances.
So he just turned off the money tap.
He turned it off. And second, his alleged persecution might have been primarily political, not religious.
How so?
Buddhist communities, particularly in the Northwest, were often seen as aligning themselves with his political enemies, the invading Indo-Greeks, like Menander and Demetrius. Attacking certain monasteries might have just been a calculated political move to suppress allies of his archenemies.
That reframes the entire narrative from pure religious zealotry to strategic political reaction. And we have archaeological evidence that contradicts the idea of universal destruction, don't we?
Crucial evidence, yes. For instance, the great stupa at Sanchi, the very site we just mentioned, so associated with Ashoka's devotion, was significantly enlarged and encased in stone during the Shuga period.
You don't enlarge and improve a major religious monument if you're universally dedicated to destroying that religion.
You absolutely do not. This suggests the shift was more subtle. The silent strategic withdrawal of funds and the cessation of political favor were far more damaging than any scattered act of violence. It was a failure of the financial life support system.
But the truly definitive, irreversible break in political mission didn't come for centuries later, right? Around the 8th century CE. That's when the new imperial dynasties consciously chose a different path for legitimation.
That's the point of no return. Before the 8th century, the Buddha was often treated as a kind of universal deity, acceptable across different kingdoms and central to the state's self-legitimizing ceremonies.
A neutral figurehead.
A neutral, prestigious figurehead. But this changed dramatically when new regional imperial powers emerged. The Gujar Pratiharas in the north, the Raidakyas in the Deccan, and the Pallavas in the south.
And what did they choose to elevate instead?
They consciously and institutionally elevated Vyon, or Siva, to the status of the supreme imperial deity. They adopted titles like Parameshvara or Supreme Lord. This wasn't just a personal religious preference, it was an ideological replacement, engineered to the highest levels of power to align the throne with a new cosmic order.
So they traded a pan-Asian ethical figurehead for a localized, powerful Hindu deity. How did they formalize that transition and make it stick?
The change was synchronized with institutional and ritual creation. This period saw the composition of new sacred texts, especially new pulads, like the Visvamotara Puras. These texts were essential.
Why? What did they do?
They provided the elaborate, detailed rules for two critical things. First, the architectural blueprint for erecting the first monumental Brahmanical Hindu temple structures designed to rival the size and grandeur of the great Buddhist viharas.
They needed a physical, impressive structure to anchor this new faith system.
Absolutely. And second, and this is crucial, they provided the detailed, elaborate imperial rituals centered on these new supreme deities. The king's installation ceremony, the Avika, was closely paralleled by complex rites used to install the image of Vyo or Siva.
Ah, so it creates this powerful feedback loop.
A robust ideological feedback loop, yes. It aligned the king of kings, with the Brahmanical hierarchy, and by doing so, relegated the Buddha to a secondary subordinate position. This macro-level shift in political mission, from Buddhist legitimation to Brahmanical, stripped Buddhism of its foundational institutional prestige and support.
The lesson here is the incredible fragility of mission. When that foundation shifts from spiritual principle to political expedience, the decay is inevitable. It's hard not to look at that historical failure and see modern reflections.
Let's turn now to how critics apply this concept of institutional drift to modern structures, specifically academia. But before we leap forward, we need to cover the second major historical failure, the failure to connect with the common person, because the political collapse was only half the story. That's right. Institutions rely on a loyal base, and Buddhism lacked one. It was fundamentally an urban phenomenon, and that proved to be a critical liability.
Tell us more about that, the urban character of Buddhism in India. Who exactly was supporting the Sangha?
Buddhism flourished in major trade hubs and cities, places like Taxila, Pataliputra, Kushinagara, and the port city of Arikamedu. Its material base was the wealthy urban elite. The merchants, the traders, the bankers, financiers, artisans.
The commercial class.
Entirely. The great monasteries, the viharas, were often strategically located along major trade routes, including the Silk Road, and they weren't just places for contemplation. They often functioned as sophisticated economic centers.
In what way?
They provided resting facilities for their patrons, and, critically, they acted as capital loan providers for these vital commercial enterprises. The Sangha was financially interlocked with the success of the trading class.
So if the trade routes thrived, the Sangha thrived. It sounds like a highly efficient, high-rise financial structure.
Yep.
But a structure like that is terrifyingly sensitive to external economic shocks.
It was nearly total, and that's the problem. Starting after the Kewada period and accelerating dramatically after the 6th century CE, India experienced widespread, catastrophic urban decay.
The cities died out.
Many did. Major centers that had been the lifeblood of the Sangha Pataliputra, for example, often became deserted or were reduced to ruins. Trade collapsed, and many major cities saw their populations just dwindle.
What happens when the geographical base collapses and your primary financial engine just disperses?
The mercantile class, the very source of the Sangha's financial system, either dispersed into smaller villages or just emigrated. This dispersal caused the monasteries to lose their solid fiscal base. Without that steady flow of large donations from wealthy urban elites, the entire material structure of the religion began to crumble.
The high-rise had no deep foundations.
And when the top floor support dissolved, the whole structure came down.
And this weakness extended even to the identity of the average person who considered themselves a Buddhist follower, the laity. Were the lay followers, the upasakas, ever truly committed to the faith?
The weakness of lay affiliation was arguably a congenital, a structural flaw, right from the very beginning. In ancient India, the term Buddhist generally referred only to the ordained monks and nuns.
Not the everyday person.
No. The lay supporters, the upasaks and upasakas, were often described by contemporary observers, and sometimes even by internal texts, as unattached well-wishers, or sometimes, quite dismissively, as fickle-minded lay associates.
That suggests a definite institutional hierarchy where the lay follower was effectively a secondary non-essential member.
They were certainly treated that way, and their spiritual life remained anchored in the traditional Brahmanical system. Lay people typically retained Brahmanical priests for all their critical life cycle rituals: birth, marriage, death, housewarming ceremonies.
So the upasaka might visit a monastery for some ethical guidance or to make a donation for merit, but when it came to major life events, they defaulted to the established system.
Precisely. Affiliation was largely individual and provisional. It often lapsed entirely after the demise of the individual supporter, or if their supporting monk or nun relocated. There was very little esprit de corps or deep communal identity among the Buddhist laity.
Any evidence of that?
The Chinese traveler Faxian noted as early as the 5th century that Buddhists and Hindus would join the same religious processions. This suggests Buddhism was perceived by the masses as a branch or a supplement to Hinduism, not an independent, distinct religion demanding absolute loyalty.
So this failure to cultivate a dedicated, distinct mass base meant that when the political and economic environment destabilized, Buddhism was just inherently vulnerable to vanishing without a trace.
It had no grassroots to fall back on.
The takeaway from this historical failure is clear. When the institution prioritized its relationship with the powerful and the wealthy, over cultivating a deep, loyal mass base, and when it let its core doctrine be so easily blended with competitors, it created a scenario where a political or economic shock could be eternal.
A fatal combination of weaknesses.
The macro-historical lesson we just uncovered is the sheer fragility of institutional mission. When the central purpose of an organization, whether it's spiritual or academic, becomes secondary to political or economic expediency, the structure starts to rot from the inside. And we see this exact dynamic play out thousands of years later when critics examine modern institutions, particularly major universities.
This parallel focuses on institutional drift, the quiet internal replacement of a founding commitment with an entirely different mandate. The modern critique argues that this drift erodes the very foundations of the institution, much like the loss of state patronage eroded the saga.
Right. And for critics of modern academia, the core failure stems from abandoning the classical liberal mission of the university. Traditionally, the university's purpose, rooted in the liberal arts tradition, was the relentless pursuit of knowledge, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
A community of scholars.
Yes, committed to open inquiry, research, and vigorous, detached debate, regardless of how immediate or uncomfortable the conclusions might be.
That vision emphasizes knowledge discovery and rational exploration of ideas, placing objectivity and open debate at the highest level of institutional value.
But critics argue that many universities have abandoned this core mission. They say it's been replaced with an alternative focus: the conscious or unconscious pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
A new mission.
A new mission. In this critique, the university is no longer simply a venue for knowledge discovery. It has transformed into a vehicle for activism, liberation, and social change. This shift is viewed as a radical departure from the classical liberal tradition that valued universal inquiry above partisan outcomes.
And this critique isn't purely philosophical. It starts by questioning the practical results of this new mission. The core question critics raise is, if the university is now a vehicle for social change, does the data show that these DEI programs actually achieve their stated goals?
Based on the research cited by these critics, the evidence suggests a resounding no, which strengthens their argument about institutional misallocation of resources. For example, a comprehensive study conducted by researchers at Harvard and Tel Aviv University.
A big one, yes.
A huge one. It covered 30 years of diversity training data from over 800 U.S. companies, and it concluded that mandatory diversity training programs had practically no effect on employee attitudes.
And the findings went further than just zero effectiveness, didn't they? The research sometimes found that mandatory training actually activated existing bias and feelings of racial hostility.
It produced the precise opposite of the intended anti-bias effect.
Right.
This evidence provides crucial ammunition for critics of academia. They argued that if these mandatory training programs show negligible or negative results in the corporate world, where internal discussion is often tightly controlled, there is no reason to believe they succeed in academia.
Where open debate is supposed to be the entire point.
Exactly, where the entire function is supposed to be open, wide-ranging, and often challenging debate aimed at reasoning toward truth. Instead, critics suggest these mandatory programs restrict the very intellectual freedom they are supposed to uphold.
The restriction of discourse is the central liberal complaint here. That the institution, instead of being a neutral arena for free thought, becomes an enforcer of a narrow political script, prioritizing perceived social justice outcomes over intellectual freedom.
To illustrate the nature of this ideological capture, critics point to investigative reporting on the specific content being implemented in public universities, often using taxpayer resources. Let's look at findings from universities in Florida, for instance, which showcase the explicit nature of some DEI programs being criticized.
What stands out in these reports is the direct challenge to the traditional meritocratic structure in the academy.
Absolutely. At the University of Central Florida, for example, the Inclusive Faculty Hiring Guide was reported to describe the concept of merit in faculty hiring as a narrative myth.
A narrative myth.
Oh.
Wow.
a narrative myth. This guide explicitly advised university employees to avoid using the term merit in job descriptions and hiring materials. Furthermore, critics note that this guide advocated explicit quotas of minoritized groups in hiring practices, thereby substituting political goals for traditional standards of academic excellence.
The key argument critics point to here is that by defining merit as a narrative myth, the university is explicitly adopting the view, often rooted in critical theory, that traditional measures of excellence are merely tools used to perpetuate systemic power structures.
Which is a huge break from tradition.
It's viewed by classical liberals as a fundamental ideological break from the enlightened belief that merit is an objective standard achievable through neutral inquiry. This is institutional drift in action, the rejection of a core founding principle.
Another finding, coming from the University of Florida, details material presented during a professional development conference that declared the United States was rooted in white supremacy and included mantras from Racists Anonymous.
Again, presented as fact.
Critics see this as institutional endorsement and advancement of a specific, highly political and partisan theory, taught as institutional fact, rather than as a subject for debate and scholarly inquiry.
And this demonstrates the perceived mission replacement, where resources dedicated to education and research are allegedly diverted to political programming aimed at advancing a specific narrative, much like ancient royal funds were diverted from Buddhist monasteries to Brahminical temples.
The investigative reporting also highlighted Florida International University's Office of Social Justice and Inclusion. Critics argue that this office effectively served as a recruiting ground for political activism.
So not just education, but mobilization.
Right. Training sessions there encouraged students to participate in grassroots campaigns, largely modeled on left-wing movements. Black Lives Matter was held up as an exemplary movement, and students were reportedly prepared for the possibility of violent confrontation with the police.
The conclusion drawn by these critics is that these initiatives are not neutral programs designed simply to increase demographic diversity. They are characterized as political programs using public resources to advance a specific partisan orthodoxy, thereby undermining the pursuit of truth that the university is ostensibly founded upon.
And just as the political mission shift in ancient India required a new framework for imperial legitimation, here, critics argue that this ideological capture requires political leaders to intervene, using democratic power to reform drifting academic institutions, an intervention we saw play out when Florida state legislation mandated the abolition of DEI programs in public universities.
So the core complaint is the same.
The core complaint in both the ancient and modern context is the same: institutional drift and the failure to maintain the founding commitment.
What's fascinating here is how that external drift, the political mission shift, is always coupled with and compounded by internal weakness. In ancient India, this drift allowed internal schisms and external rivals to devour Buddhism. Now let's turn back to the historical case to see how the inner life of the Buddhist saga was weakening long before the final external shock.
Okay, so the internal decay.
While the withdrawal of royal and mercantile patronage was devastating, internal divisions also compounded Buddhism's vulnerability. Sectarianism became a reality as early as the 2nd century BCE, with different schools adopting different languages for their canon Pali, Sanskrit, local vernaculars, and carving out distinct geographical regions of influence.
This sounds like bitter internal doctrinal fights. The rise of Mahayana, which is sometimes viewed as undermining the stricter earlier Hinayana traditions, and then later Vajrayana. Did that internal fighting cause the collapse?
The evidence suggests that sectarianism, however bitter, was not the causa sine qua non, the indispensable cause of the decline. We see intense rivalry, like the intellectual heavyweight Candrakirti severely criticizing all non-Madhyamika Buddhist systems. There was genuine intellectual combat.
But that wasn't the fatal blow.
It wasn't. We know this because Jainism, a contemporary religion, also suffered from severe sectarianism, including radical schisms and geographical splits, yet it managed to survive and even flourish in pockets of India. The damage was done not by debate, but by a crisis of integrity and identity.
Let's focus on that crisis of integrity, the moral state of the Sag. Some theories vehemently point to internal degeneracy as the core rot. What evidence from the historical texts supports this claim?
The degeneracy argument is based on numerous laments found in Buddhist and non-Buddhist texts. They suggest the saga increasingly contained what they called undesirable and irresponsible elements.
People who weren't true believers.
People who entered monastic life simply because they had no better option, or as the historical sources put it, faute de mieux. These included vagrants, thieves, and idlers who saw the Sangha as a retirement plan or an escape from household responsibilities, not a genuine spiritual calling.
So becoming a monk or nun was a way to opt out of the social contract, leading to a spiritual elite that was, frankly, corrupt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Later texts paint a very dark picture. The Theragatha refers to monks who had once been wealthy but now do evil for the sake of a spoonful of rice, and others are described as cheats, frauds, false witnesses, unscrupulous. The descriptions become shockingly vivid.
Like what?
Speaking of monks who are lazy and a glutton, a sleeper who rolls as he lies, like a great hog fed on grain.
Wow. It's jarring to read about gallivanting monks and nuns acting as go-betweens or even procuresses in ancient texts. If the ethical standard was so low, why weren't the lay supporters just voting with their feet and abandoning the faith sooner?
Because the degeneracy wasn't just moral, it was economic. We see evidence of influential viharas issuing their own seals and coins, hoarding tremendous wealth, and investing it like sophisticated lay supporters. The Ramanjushimulakalpa even talks about monks who would become industrialists, or bikavo bahukarmanta.
Monks as industrialists. That completely muddies the lines between the secular wealthy elite and the spiritual elite. And the moral corruption went beyond just money.
It did. The Radhapalaparichya Sutra mentions gallivanting monks possessed of wives, sons, and daughters, who were indisciplined and uncontrolled in eating and sex play. Even the non-Buddhist Kashmiri text, the Rajatharogan, describes a monastery where one half was reserved for regular monks and the other half was reserved for those who had wives and families.
So the integrity of the institution, its core spiritual mission of asceticism and renunciation, was just dissolving from within.
Completely.
But despite this profound ethical and institutional breakdown, you argue that even this widespread corruption wasn't the primary cause of the ultimate decline. That seems counterintuitive.
It is the paradox of degeneracy. Firstly, historical and contemporary examples show that laxity and corruption existed in other religions that still thrived. Many modern temples and religious institutions, as you know, operate like highly efficient, money-grabbing businesses, yet they persist because they serve a deep social function.
And
Secondly, evidence of corruption dates back almost to the time of the Buddha himself. If it were the primary cause, Buddhism would not have survived for over 1,000 years in India. Therefore, the rot was a weakness, a serious one, but it needed a much stronger external force to become terminal.
So if the internal fighting and the corruption were not the key factor, what was the internal dynamic that made it so vulnerable?
It was ideological assimilation, what we term the friendly embrace of Brahmanical Hinduism. The rise of Mahayana and then Vajrayana, while intellectually vigorous, exposed Buddhism to subversive encroachments of Brahmanical Hinduism. They adopted the sophisticated language of Sanskrit, which was a strategic mistake because it made the scriptures inaccessible to the common person, and they incorporated various Brahmanical deities like Siva and Vyu into the Buddhist pantheon.
It sounds like they adopted too much of the competition style in an attempt to look relevant and sophisticated.
They blurred the boundaries too successfully. The deification of the Buddha and the adoption of an expanding pantheon made the distinct Buddhist identity dangerously nebulous. In the end, the walls dividing Buddhist deities like Avalokiteshvara and the Hindu deity Shiva, or the Buddhist goddess Tara and the Hindu goddess Parvati, were simply blown out of existence in the eyes of the common layperson.
And the most brilliant strategic move by the Brahmanical tradition to cement this assimilation was surely the avatar device.
It was an ingenious means to assimilate and subordinate the Buddha without having to destroy him. Vyu's avatar device allowed the transcendent God to take countless forms across history. And this device was strategically used to make the Buddha the 9th incarnation of Vyan.
So instead of being the supreme and unique historical figure who founded the ultimate path, he became merely a transitional figure in the larger, eternal story of Vishnu.
Precisely. This process was devastating because it undermined the Buddha's unique historicity and relegated him to a mere subordinate appendage of the Vaikava mythic hierarchy. He was ritually included, but only as a subordinate figure whose purpose, in some accounts, was even to mislead the wicked.
And this highlights that critical weakness we discussed. The Buddhists failed to define and defend their core mission or differentiate themselves institutionally from their most robust competitor.
They didn't put up a fight.
How do we know this failure was strategic and not just an accident of history?
We know it by contrasting Buddhism with Jainism. The Jainas, facing the exact same pressures loss of patronage, sectarianism, The threat of assimilation mounted an active strategic defense. Jainists rejected the idea that Abha, their first Tirthankara, was a Vedan incarnation. That was step one, define the boundary.
And what was the strategic step two that provided that psychology of survival?
They went a crucial step further. They actively created alternate, Jaina-centric versions of the most popular and culturally powerful Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They depicted Rama and Kut not as divine beings, but as worldly Jaina heroes, subject to Jaina ethical laws.
A profound act of cultural sovereignty. Give us an example of how this rewriting played out.
Well, in the Jaina version of the Ramayana, Rama does not kill Ravan. Instead, his brother Lakshman performs the necessary immoral job of violence. Rama is later reborn in heaven because he strictly adheres to ahimsa, nonviolence.
And Krishna?
Kay, whose deeds of violence were too numerous to whitewash, is condemned to a temporary hell. This allowed the Jainas to subordinate the most popular Hindu figures within a uniquely Jaina ethical and cosmological context. They reinforced their identity while accommodating the popular appeal of the epic stories.
That is the difference between survival and absorption. The Jainas created a distinct cultural framework to inoculate themselves against assimilation. Buddhism, in tragic contrast, made no serious institutional attempt to refute the Avatara notion or contest this subordination.
The historical parallel is striking. The failure to define and defend the core mission, compounded by a lack of grassroots loyalty, made the institution susceptible to being absorbed by a more robust and adaptable competitor.
Right.
And this internal weakening ensured that when the truly devastating external shocks arrived, the religion had no capacity to recover.
The ultimate external shocks came from the invasions, but even before the final Turkic attacks, there were economic and political miscalculations regarding the earlier Arab invasions, particularly in Sind in 711 CE.
That's where the economic consequences of relying on the mercantile class became devastatingly clear. At the time of the Arab invasion of Sind, the Brahmanical Hindus were predominantly rural farmers, while the Buddhists were overwhelmingly the urban class, merchants, traders, artisans.
And interestingly, the Buddhists in Sind initially collaborated with the Arab invaders. Why? What was their calculation?
It was a calculation based purely on mercantile self-interest. The Silk Road and maritime routes connecting China to the Sindhi ports were vital. The urban Buddhists hoped that the Arab conquest would regularize and reopen the interregional trade routes, believing their economic interests would be better served under an Arab trade empire that spanned from the Middle East to India.
That expectation went drastically wrong, resulting in a phenomenon sociologists call relative deprivation.
It was a disastrous miscalculation. The new pan-Islamic international trade network that emerged was eventually controlled by the Muslim mercantile bourgeoisie. Buddhist merchants quickly found it difficult to compete. Furthermore, discriminatory customs regulations were imposed.
Meaning
non-Muslim merchants had to pay double duty on goods compared to their Muslim counterparts.
double duty on goods, that's a massive competitive disadvantage.
Exactly. As their share of the trade and the accumulation of capital rapidly declined, the urban mercantile Buddhists experienced relative deprivation. They saw their Muslim counterparts prospering under the new regime, while their own precarious economic position deteriorated precisely because they were non-Muslims.
And the solution they sought was conversion, often driven purely by financial expediency.
Conversion, in this context, was viewed as financially beneficial, allowing them access to the lower customs duties and the new trade network. This was a gradual but deeply corrosive process. The conversion of the urban mercantile Buddhists to Islam often occurred for social, economic, or political expediency rather than immediate spiritual conviction.
And this was a terminal blow to the Sangha's fiscal base.
A terminal blow. The new Arab trade patterns completely bypassed the credit and transport facilities traditionally provided by the viharas. The monks were cut off from their primary source of funding, and the institution began to starve.
And then came the final external shock. The Turkic attacks led by figures like Bakhtiar Khalji, which many historians used to frame as the sole raison le plus décisif, the most decisive reason for Buddhism's demise.
While some older histories place the sole blame on the Turkic attacks starting at the end of the 12th century CE, they were more accurately the coup de grace, the final blow.
Not the cause, but the final push.
Exactly. The attacks were undeniably violent and targeted the major institutional centers. Important Mahaviharas like Udantapuri, Vikramashila, Sarnath, and the monumental Nalanda were attacked and destroyed. The Tabakati Nasiri records the massacre of monks, which occurred because the soldiers frequently mistook the massive walled monasteries for defensive forts.
The violence was real, and the destruction of the libraries and centers of learning was irreversible. But you emphasize that the motivation was primarily political, not purely religious fanaticism.
Yes. The campaigns were fundamentally a drive to conquer territory and gain booty, typically occurring at the cutting edge of a moving military frontier. Persecution alone, however brutal, rarely wipes out an entire religion completely. The key reason the Turkic attacks were so effective was structural.
Because Buddhism lacked deep, enduring roots among the rural masses.
Exactly. The Brahmanical Hindus and Jainas, supported by a loyal, rural laity, could scatter and reorganize in the countryside. The destruction of their temples didn't destroy their faith structure.
But the Buddhist monks, confined to an elitist, urban, and royal support system, had no such fallback.
With the physical destruction of the great educational centers, which were their only real base of operations, the monks who escaped the massacre were left with nowhere to disperse, hide, and regroup in the plains of India. They had lost their social glue function entirely.
And this vacuum was perfectly filled by a highly successful, mass-oriented competitor that understood the new social and economic reality, the Bhakti movement.
The Bhakti movement, which gained significant momentum from the 6th century onwards, presented an intense, direct, and overwhelmingly successful challenge. It offered the Bhakti Marga, or path of devotion to a personal God, which was suited to the psychology and needs of the lower rungs of a caste-based society.
It promised liberation irrespective of caste or sect.
An egalitarian message articulated powerfully in texts like the Bhagavad Gita. This offered the common person an emotional, accessible pathway that Buddhism, with its highly intellectual, monastic, and elite focus, had utterly failed to provide. It bypassed the need for complex philosophy.
And crucially, the Bhakti movement was fundamentally rooted in the new land-based feudal economy that was replacing the older urban merchant economy.
Yes. It successfully adopted egalitarian media like song and dance, attracting tremendous popular enthusiasm. And more than just a spiritual movement, it fostered a powerful political and social structure, the Brahmin-peasant alliance.
How are the Brahmanas able to pivot from being the keepers of often inaccessible Vedic ritual to being the leaders in a grassroots agrarian movement?
They became indispensable to the new agrarian economy. The Brahmanas were instrumental in agrarian expansion because they possessed crucial knowledge of agricultural techniques, astronomy, and a working calendar knowledge vital for successful farming. The large, expensive, urban-centric Buddhist monasteries offered none of this practical, decentralized knowledge to the rural masses.
So the Brahmanas provided the intellectual and spiritual framework, while the peasants provided the economic base and manpower.
And the result was the temple-centered economy. This system saw the creation of large estates, devasvam and brahmasvam, controlled by Brahmana priests as trustees. These estates became the dynamic new force in the economy, providing kings with political legitimation for bringing new areas under cultivation.
Essentially, the Brahmins offered the kings a practical, agrarian, and socio-politically cohesive model that the detached urban Buddhist Sangha simply couldn't compete with. It was a structural replacement of one institutional pillar by a more adaptable, popular one.
The outcome was that this Brahmin-peasant alliance formed the basis of socio-political power to the complete disadvantage of Buddhism. Buddhism had lost its social glue function and was fatally stuck in an elitist urban model.
And the rise of Bhakti, with its powerful emotional appeal and its deep roots in the land-based economy, gave the finishing touches to the assimilation of Buddhism's remnants into the overarching Brahmanical Hindu framework, completing the collapse of the old order.
The end of the story.
This deep dive into the crumbling of an ancient institutional pillar reveals a profound set of macro-historical lessons about the fate of traditional societal pillars. First and foremost is the inherent fragility of the elite institution.
We see a pattern across millennia. Institutions face the exact same risks when they drift from their core founding principles and lose genuine connection with a broad, loyal base. The historical record suggests that the intellectual snobbery and social aloofness of the Buddhist Sangha kept it fundamentally out of touch with the hoi polloi.
Its failure was rooted in its mentality.
Its failure was rooted in its mentality of remaining merely a specialized sect within the broader Brahmanical Hinduism, instead of pulling itself out psychologically and structurally to become a distinct, self-sufficient mass movement.
The core conflict, whether we look at 7th century India or 21st century academia, seems to be a debate about fundamental mission. Is the institution meant for detached, pure inquiry, the pursuit of the good, true, and beautiful? Or is it meant to be a vehicle for immediate socio-political transformation, like activism, liberation, and social change?
And the historical outcome suggests that when the latter supersedes the former, the institution loses its distinctive identity and, crucially, its structural resilience. The concern among critics today is precisely that loss of common sense and unifying mission in the face of radical partisan ideologies.
And we cannot overlook the contrast with Jainism, which provides the critical lesson in institutional survival.
Absolutely. The difference between the disappearance of Buddhism and the survival of Jainism was the latter's psychological preparedness and strategic effort to actively contest and counter the Brahman's full assimilation process, particularly the Avatara device.
It demonstrates that intellectual adaptability combined with an internal psychology of survival.
The will to clearly define and defend the boundaries is paramount to institutional longevity. Buddhism lacked that essential mechanism to thwart the friendly, assimilative onslaught.
It is a history of being outmaneuvered not by an invading army, but by a subtler, more adaptable ideology.
The profound irony is that Buddhism, the religion that found its greatest success by adapting and spreading across Asia, failed in its birthplace, not through outright defeat, but by becoming too successful at compromise, allowing itself to be gradually absorbed and made unnecessary by the very forces it sought to reform.